So welcome to everyone to this particular session, and I'd like to welcome you to the back of my vehicle, which I'm actually on my way from Strawn through to Hobart. So the great modern technology allowing me to be with you and in your office while I'm on my holidays with my families. But I did want to be involved in this particular session because PwC is very passionate about offshore and the great work that it does in the community in relation to cybercrime. Just to give you a little bit of background in relation to myself, I've been a partner with PwC for well over 22 years, and I did head up, and I do head up, but I'm a founder of our business Align and Connect business, which basically looks for the best startup companies or scale-up companies in Australia to help them in their growth and to introduce them into the market. So our role is to basically find the best. We do a lot of work to ensure that there is a lot of that the work that we do in relation to their systems and everything else, that they don't have any problems, so that we do our own cyber checks in relation to all of our clients and all the issues that they need to cover off on prior to coming into the program. Offshore is one of our founding partners and has been with us for well over 2 years and has been very successful in the market when we've been introducing them to our clients. And the reason why they're so successful, in my view, is that they have a very simple method of actually trying to make sure that you are paying the right party. They've basically come up with a way of assessing who is in the market, are you paying the right person, and they have verified the people that you've actually purchased, that you're actually paying in relation to the process overall. Now, what that does do is it means that instead of you having to check on a payment by payment basis, you can use their software to verify everything that's been done, that you are paying the correct party. And effectively, in my view, it means instead of having 1 or 2 friends who are checking out your clients, you've got about 1.4 million friends who are crowdsourcing everything for you to make sure you're paying the correct party. So no chance of cyber fraud in relation to your payments. This is so important in terms of the world today, where we're seeing more and more cyber warfare, more and more problems in relation to what's actually happening out there. So we do need to have companies like offshore there to help us in relation to these particular opportunities. So on that note, hopefully you will enjoy the session by Gavin, and I look forward to hearing and enjoying the session that Gavin goes through and explains exactly how offshore provides that safety in terms of your business. So Gavin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ross, and thanks to all of you for joining. We've got a huge volume of people on this webinar, well over 100, and thank you for taking the time out of your day. Ross and myself will turn our cameras off at this point so we can turn our attention to the slides, but we're well present. So with that, my camera will go off and I'll begin the presentation. I'll take about 20 minutes to 25 minutes to talk about the cybercrime landscape and hopefully provide a little bit of insight or value around the nuances of most of these modern cybercrime scams. Then I will use, let's say, a couple of minutes to conceptually talk about how we're solving it, because I'm certainly not here to shove our solution or product down your throat. That would be disingenuous and somewhat boring. I think what's more interesting is conceptually how we solving a very tricky problem using the scale of the cloud and the power of the crowd or the community. It's a communal approach to fighting back against modern cybercrime and payments fraud. And then lastly, I'll talk about a case study, which is quite interesting. So with that, let's dive in. And, you know, we used someone at FCHR criticized myself and Nick for the way we invited people to this webinar, because what they said was we're using what's commonly called FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt. But there is some truth to those feelings around cybercrime and our language around it, because it really is ramping up. There's not a chart or graph or statistic globally or locally around cybercrime and payments fraud within that that goes down. It all goes up. And I think part of that is Australia, despite having quantums less businesses, certainly by ABN, than markets like the US and the UK, is highly targeted by scammers. Often we get asked, well, where are the scammers from? They tend to be global, but there is a higher incidence of them in areas like Eastern Europe, parts of Asia, China. But as our friend and partner Peter Price, the chairman of Crime Stoppers, often reminds me, the biggest exporter of cybercrime is still the United States. So that's some food for thought. It's just one statistic in a, sorry, I can see the slides are not actually changing. So if you just give me a moment, there you go. That statistic that we're one of the 3 most targeted countries is just one in a sea of statistics about cybercrime. And I'm not going to belabor them because I think one's shutters really come down. But in a sea of statistics, I just want to flag one, which is we did a survey across all our customers, which is several hundred finance and AP teams, towards the back end of last year, and 68% of AP managers said their job had become more stressful due to fake invoice or email scams. And I think AP is often like a forgotten constituency in these big picture issues like cybercrime and payments fraud, but they're at the front line. If I could borrow a term, they're the frontline workers of payments fraud, and often unfairly expected to combat it alone. But despite these statistics, the one we turn everyone's attention to is this very innocent number, but I guess the prime, which is 1. And why we try focus attention on 1 is put best by Brad Smith, who's Chief Legal Officer of Microsoft, who I think about 2 years ago said this: every company has at least 1 employee who will click on anything. And perhaps some of you are ruminating on who that team member or employee is. And it doesn't matter who they are. What matters is just that this is probably true of most organizations. Then what we do is we think Brad Smith's statement, however prescient, is somewhat outmoded, because cybercrime's that doesn't capture the challenge of modern cybercrime. We'd modify that statement and say every company has at least 1 supplier with 1 employee who will click on anything. And I could actually add to that and go, every company has at least 1 supplier with 1 employee who may click on something once, because that's all it takes. And what that does is it begs the question of modern payments fraud, and to a degree cybercrime, which is it's no longer about the integrity of just your software, that your system is secure, that access is limited and controlled. It's also no longer about the behavior of your company's staff, whether it's your own team or the general staff complement of the business. The problem of modern payments fraud is actually about your vulnerability by virtue of the behavior of your suppliers and their teams. And that's a complex problem to solve. And while I will go into sort of supplier email compromise scams in more detail in a few moments, I will say at this point that so much, the fastest growing form of cybercrime, as recently as a report published by payments.com and Bottom Line out of the UK, we saw the report, I think just yesterday, is that the fastest growing form of cybercrime, certainly, and payments fraud, certainly in Australia and certainly in the UK and the US, is this genre called social engineering, the biggest manifestation of which is called business email compromise. And what happens there is a supplier to you, their system or email is compromised, they are impersonated, you pay them thinking you're paying the right people, and the payment is diverted to the fraudster. And that's the challenge one has to think about today. And as far back as 2015, 2016, Google and Facebook discovered this the hard way when that man in the top right-hand corner of your screen, Evaldus Remisauskas, defrauded Facebook and Google of $167 million. And the reason why we're very aware of it, not just because it's our industry, but Channel 7 and a few other outlets asked us for our commentary on this. And really what we said to them at the time, and what I'd say to you today, is very much this. If Google and Facebook can get defrauded of $167 million by a man using methods from 2016, which have only advanced, where does that leave you and your organization? And most organizations. And we could fast forward to from 2016 to November last year, 2018, when this fund, Levitas Capital, clicked on a Zoom invite. One of the principals, Michael Fagan, clicked on the wrong Zoom invite, and it actually led to the demise of his fund. And I'll loop back to that story because it's a very prescient case study once I've unpacked business email compromise. So before we dive into unpacking the tactics of these scams, I just want to talk a bit more globally about what is driving the problem. At the heart of the problem is a structural flaw in the Australian banking system. And in fact, a structural flaw in almost all global banking systems, be they South Africa, Singapore, UK, most European banks, and certainly the US, which is, for those of you who do business in the US, will always be alarmed that it's heavily still dependent on check processing. But the flaw in the banking system in those markets, and certainly here, is that the banking system does not match payee names to BSBN account numbers. In fact, the banks will go so far as to remind you of that every time you log on with these sort of disclaimer statements. And I've picked 3 of our big 4, but I could pick all the banks. And they really say if you authorize the payment, the liability is yours. That's why in some coverage of these scams, they call it authorized push payment fraud, because you're authorizing the payment and then you're pushing the payment when you hit that confirm or authorize button in your banking, or sometimes in your ERP if you've got throughput processing right to the bank. So if you hit that button, you're liable, the bank isn't, which only adds to the bank's reluctance to remedy the problem. There are other reasons why the banks don't solve this problem, and we're happy to talk about that in the Q&A at the end. But the bank does not match payee names to numbers, which gives the fraudsters the gap to change the number. You check the name, it's impossible to check the number at volume, and you pay the wrong people. But that's just one kind of horseman of the kind of 5 horsemen of the side of the payment fraud apocalypse. The next one is identity fraud. And we're very familiar with the concept of identity theft on a personal level, but what you're seeing in the commercial world is business identity theft through impersonating email and other documents. So you've got business identity theft. The more connected we get, the more cheap and democratized software gets, the easier it is to steal people's identity. Social media, whether it's personal social media like LinkedIn or corporate social media, personal social media like Facebook, or corporate social media like LinkedIn and their other platforms, they've really given fraudsters an entree into how to steal one's identity, impersonate you. And then the next kind of component would just be a highly digitally connected supply chain, which increases the opportunity for fraudsters. The 4th factor would be highly prevalent email usage. I'm not going to go into this, but there are so many studies which really reveal that email in particular is a highly vulnerable system, including Office, Enterprise, Gmail, and a whole lot of other platforms. They really can be breached, and malicious emails can get through them. But then there's a 5th factor, which is somewhat contentious, which adds this perfect storm, which is, although you and other financial leaders would have invested in ERP, digital transformation of certain accounting processes and finance processes, along with other functions in the business, this digital transformation often fails to close manual gaps in payment controls and payment checking. At some point, you might have someone checking someone, or at some point, you might have humans and people taking data and putting it into ERP and vendor management and accounting software. And those manual moments, those human moments, really are what create, especially in terms of controls and checking, create the gaps for fraudsters to exploit. And to go into that for a moment, we know most businesses do have controls. We're not naive, and often are improving their controls. But often things like callback controls, checking suppliers before they're entered into vendor management or before they're paid, are done incorrectly. And I'll unpack that a bit later on. And vendor management systems, yes, they help, as do certain parts of AP automation, but they are susceptible to, they're flawed. You know, a Trojan can change an ABA file or a payments file. An insider can manipulate them. Errors can still go into those systems. So they don't alone solve the problem, and certainly not at volume and at scale. So if I had to boil down the issue, it's a question of identity. How do we know who's on the other side of the computer? And hence, how do we know who we're paying? Plus, as COVID last year dispersed us home, while I think we will get to the other side of COVID, a more blended work environment is here to stay. And if you've got teams sitting geographically distributed, whether it's at home or in various remote locations, you're amplifying the risk, because we know that payment, both financial and IT control environments weaken as you distribute people. But perhaps it's better said in the words of a CFO who we were chatting to at some point last year, who said to us, you know, I just paid $1 million of invoices from my kitchen table. And to me, that kind of just summed things up. So that's the landscape. Inside of that landscape, these are the scams we're seeing impact AP teams and put your payments at risk. The most prevalent, as I said earlier, is supplier or business email compromise, and I'll unpack that. Executive fraud, a variation on supplier email compromise. Insider scams, or what we call nefarious employees. And then, with apologies to George Michael, careless whispers, because careless whispers is our labeling of poor password hygiene, which will amplify and accelerate all the above 3 scams. And that's why I say 3 + 1. All of them result in a change in details, and as I said, a change in bank account numbers, which the banking system does not trap and pick up. So you making the wrong payment, thinking you're paying a legitimate vendor or supplier, but actually paying into the fraudster's bank account, the loss of the money, and an extremely difficult recovery. How difficult? Well, we've seen studies, including one from KPMG, that looked at about 15 different large banks in the APAC region alone, and only half the victims of cybercrime in those 14 banks ever recovered a quarter or more of the funds. The rest was completely gone. So at best, you're recovering a quarter, and that's only 1 in 2 people will even recover a quarter. The other point I'll make is the money lost is not the full impact. The real cost of cybercrime or a payment fraud could be at least 3x or 5x the funds lost due to system downtime, morale damage, legal fees, and not to mention reputational damage, which can be absolutely devastating. So let's go into one of these or 2 of these scams. And I'm taking a bit longer than I thought, so I'm going to speed up. So you've got a fraudster. Another point I'll make is fraudsters are not teenagers in garages trying to prove a point to the world. Fraudsters are organizations. Those organizations might be formalized. They might come together to do scams and crimes and then disperse. They could be loose, they could be more fixed, often offshore. But the point is they're technologically advanced, they're highly organized, and all the funds, time, and effort you're spending on technology, they're doing the same. If you're looking at AI, they're looking at AI. If you're looking at machine learning, they're looking at machine learning. And they're intentional and committed, and as I said earlier on, are targeting countries like the UK, the US, and Australia. And what they will do is, let's say they want to target a business like AutoWorks, a notional, I've made it up, someone in the auto trade, let's say in Queensland, and they want to target AutoWorks. In the old days, they might send some worm or infrastructural tech attack onto AutoWorks. They don't need to do that anymore. Today, they will use various advanced or simple means like Google to research the relationship between a company and its suppliers. They'll go find out who AutoWorks does business with. If they don't want to do that research, they can do an en masse sort of phishing attack, and then work backwards and work out who AutoWorks connect with. But let's say they do some basic research, and then what they do is they launch these phishing attacks. And these phishing attacks use email, and they'll be the emails we often are warned about by the media or occasionally see in our inboxes, sometimes picked up by our spam filters, sometimes not. But these emails, and here's an example of a real one, will use brands we know and trust to seduce that single unexpected person, that person that Brad Page from Microsoft mentioned, which is you just need one person to click once. They will seduce that person into clicking. Be it this Microsoft email, here's one from Dropbox, another one from PayPal, and sometimes you see these things from government departments, banks themselves, but they're really trying to get a click. And some people's spam filters might reject them. Other people might smell a rat because they're more aware. Maybe they've attended webinars like this. But as we said earlier on, they just need one person to click once. And let's say in this case, it's the accounts receivable officer or the financial manager at a notional supplier called Tireco, and Dave at Tireco, maybe he's rejected a couple of these emails, maybe he smelled a rat 9 times out of 10, but this one gets through both his spam filters, but also his own awareness, and he clicks. Now, when Dave clicks, in the more primitive sense, that click could take him to a phishing site, which I'll talk about in a moment. But quite often, just the click alone might insert malware into Dave's email system, just the click alone. But let's do the more sort of rudimentary method. Dave clicks, and it takes him to a phishing site. In this case, a Microsoft one, or keeping with my examples earlier on, a Dropbox one. These are real phishing sites I'm showing you. And when Dave logs into those phishing sites, what he's in effect doing is passing his login credentials to the fraudster. And now the fraudster is in Dave's email system. And what the fraudster can do is co-opt Dave's email and send either a manipulated invoice, which is easy to do with the fraudster's bank account number on it, to AutoWorks, or can just write an email to AutoWorks saying, hey, we've changed our bank account details. The important thing to note, and I can't stress this enough, is the fraudster co-opts Dave's real email account. The emails that AutoWorks received with manipulated invoices or just an instruction to pay a new bank account come from Dave. And they will often use the previous email trails between AutoWorks and Dave. And in fact, we've seen many instances where they will borrow Dave's style of language, Dave's turn of phrase, Dave's use of slang. You know, maybe Dave's a South African like me, and he often says, "How's it?" They will borrow that term. It is very hard then for AutoWorks' AP team to pick that up. Okay, so really, it is a full impersonation and a theft of Dave's identity by way of email or other means. What we also notice is fraudsters know that AutoWorks might have an AP team that verifies suppliers. So what they sometimes do is phone ahead. And this is something you really want to take back to your teams immediately off this webinar. Look for the call ahead. That is a trick we've seen used to devastating effect. The fraudster phones ahead and says, hey, expect an email. I'm Dave or Sally or Janice or whoever it is from Tireco, and we have in fact changed our bank account details. They phone ahead to avoid the callback control. Let's say AutoWorks, they just want to double check. They phone Dave at Tireco. They email Dave at Tireco. By the way, if you want to know what happens if they do a good callback control, as I said, those are often fallible, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But also what we've noticed is phone numbers can very easily get ported. So you think you're phoning Dave at Tireco, but part of the scam is it diverts the number to the fraudster. But let's say they email back. Dave never gets that checking email because the first thing fraudsters do with software once they're in an email system is they put filtering software in, and Dave never receives the email. The fraudster, in fact, receives it, doubles down on the initial bank change request, confirms to AutoWorks that the bank has changed, and AutoWorks pay the wrong person, pay the fraudster. And we've seen really sophisticated nuances like this. We've seen a reverse BEC email compromise where, and I'll try just stop here for a second. The fraudster actually then acts as Dave and tells a whole lot of customers, ignore my emails because I've been compromised. Give me a day or two. Then again, this is the fraudster saying that. The fraudster will mail later saying, we've solved the problem, we've cleaned up our emails, but as part of that process, we've changed our bank account details, pay these new accounts. I mean, that's really nuanced. But moving on, the second type of email compromise scam, and very prevalent, especially in larger companies where there's multiple layers of management, is an executive fraud. Exactly the same as a supplier email compromise in modality, but instead of impersonating a supplier, they infiltrate the email of a senior executive, and then they impersonate that executive to a more junior member of staff, instructing them with urgency, maybe it's on a Friday afternoon, to pay a supplier where they're really paying themselves. So it's the same thing, but you're infiltrating within a company and you're impersonating an executive within a company to a more junior member of staff. Earlier on, I mentioned this somewhat tragic fraud or scam purported on Levitas Capital, a really successful and fast-growing hedge fund in Sydney. And it was well covered in the press. And why I want to come back to this is it's almost a combined supplier email compromise and an executive fraud. So what happened here was the fraudsters set up an investee company with the purpose of defrauding Levitas Capital. So they set up a company, in fact, 3 different businesses, 1 in Australia, 2 offshore, 1 in Singapore, 1 in Hong Kong. They then, that was step 1. Step 2 was they sent the principals of Levitas Capital, the 2 gentlemen in the picture, a fake Zoom invite, which they clicked on, and at that point got into Michael Fagan, one of the principals' email accounts. The third step was they sent, I wouldn't call it an invoice, but they sent a call for capital document, sort of an invoice, to Levitas Capital's administrators and trustees, knowing those administrators and trustees would get authorization from the principal, Michael Fagan, before moving $2 million into their supposed investee company. Michael Fagan was at gym. The trustees emailed him. The fraudsters were now in Michael Fagan's email address by way of the fake Zoom invite, confirmed the transfer of funds. $2 million was moved to this fake company, then quickly moved from that fake company's bank account to 3 different ANZ branches in Queensland, withdrawn. $1 million was withdrawn from some ATMs and the individual left the country. There were 2 further tranches of investments done the same way, totaling $8 million. They recovered 7, lost 1. But here's the tragedy. Australian Catholic Super, who are about to make a big investment into Levitas Capital, was so rattled by the failure of controls that they withdrew their investment, or stopped it at least, and the fund, I think, collapsed. Now, you might think, oh, you know, that wouldn't have happened to us. There were controls in place. They just weren't good enough to detect this kind of social engineering or email compromise scam. So that's what's driving modern payment fraud at the moment. And the scammers are changing tactics, both psychological and technological, each and every day. So what do you do about it? And I'd like to sort of start shifting into solutions. But I want to pause here. The internal controls you think are in place may not be. I just want to talk about callbacks for a moment. If callbacks are not done expertly and correctly, they will fail. So a couple of things. Do not take details of invoices. You know, those invoices can be manipulated. You also need to be really rigorous around never receiving information. You've got to seek out information. So you can never take information from a message, and certainly not from an incoming email. Often we see a callback, the supplier details are sourced correctly and independently, but then they get through to a person and ask the wrong questions. They lead the witness, as a lawyer might say. They phone someone and say, is this your bank account? And of course, a fraudster could go, yes, it is, if those details have been incorrectly sourced. And then, as I said, a call ahead, where the fraudster phones ahead to avoid the callback. And then, as I said, vendor management systems are never as locked down as you think. We've seen instances where Trojans are inserted indirectly through email, and they just automatically and remotely edit ABA or payment files. So it's good to do those, but it's not quite enough. So if you had to ask for a solution set, because it's easy for me to, raise FUD or fear, uncertainty, doubt, but I think mitigating that is solution. So this is an easy one to overlook. In our view, there are 4 pillars, and pillar 1 is awareness and culture. If you've got a team or a broader organization that doesn't want to look embarrassed or bad by asking whether they should click or trust certain things, you're increasing your own risk. You want to create a culture in your own team and your greater organization that it is totally fine to ask supposedly dumb questions about what to click on. How do you create awareness? Well, sorry, culture is your remit and your senior team's remit, and can't comment further on that. But awareness, events like this, keep up to date with the government's got great resources like the ACCC Scam Watch. You can set up Google alerts for payments fraud or cybercrime, as we do, and you might have other cybersecurity providers who can keep you up to date. So I would do all that. If you're in a large organization with a well-resourced IT department, they should be running occasional simulations. And as frustrating or irritating as those are, it's the right thing. So awareness and culture is a cornerstone. The next thing is basic security hygiene. Complex, longer passwords, and most certainly unique passwords for different applications. Because that way, if email gets compromised, your accounting software or ERP might not be. And then most apps allow for 2-factor authentication. Please, please, please turn it on. It can go a long way to preventing not just breaches, but these, let's say a fraudster is successful with an email compromise, it might mitigate the damage. Policies and protocols, I don't need to talk to this audience about, which is good accounting and control and governance practices, certainly segregation of duties, audit logs, and restricting and isolating access to information generally, but also applications, software and digital applications. I think another comment to make is staff leaving is often poorly managed, even by the best companies. I've worked for an organization, and 3 years later was still logging in, not to their hardcore stuff, but certain web apps, just because they failed to remedy that. So you really want to manage tightly the exit of staff. And then I guess the final pillar takes me a bit closer to our world, which is tools. And there are tools. There's virus and email protection software, which I'm sure you're using, and that would be like a baseline. There's certainly identity management tools, would encourage those. And then you would have invested in accounting software and maybe more specific vendor management modules. But we're in a space that we call fraud tech. We are a unique solution to this very particular problem of email compromise, which is a unique solution to the problem of how do you protect yourself when supplier-related vulnerabilities and failures can compromise you. And I just want to talk conceptually about how we do that. So we boiled down the problem to one of identity. How do we know who is on the other side of the computer? How can we tell you who you're paying and where it counts, which is before you pay? And we talk about collaborative cybersecurity, and that might be a somewhat anemic phrase, but the word collaboration does not often belong with the phrase security or cyber. But it's harnessing a safety in numbers approach that we've seen used to enable and accelerate progress in other areas like navigation, think of Google Maps, travel, think of TripAdvisor, where you're using the power of the crowd and the scale of the cloud and the internet in general terms to solve a problem. And the problem we were trying to solve, as I flagged earlier on, is this one. How do we create a kind of perimeter of defense around your community of suppliers, a community that you can't directly control? Yes, you can make requests. Yes, there can be certain compliance things and standards they have to adhere to, but you can't control the behavior and IT security environments of those businesses. And how we've gone about creating a solution is creating a massive community of verified businesses that's bigger than any one or your individual supplier community. So let me talk about that for a moment. As I said, it's one thing if a friend says to you, go to the Bellagio in Las Vegas or go to Joe's Pizza restaurant down the road. Yes, you might trust that friend, but would you trust them to the same extent as 17,000 people in effect telling you go to the Bellagio, it's good? Or for that matter, 500 people telling you it's bad? That's a far more informed, verified decision. Similarly, Google Maps uses multiple data sets to tell you the best way home. It's using crowd and cloud to do something. And what we've done is taken that same methodology and that same conceptual framework and using the same technology to create a verified community of businesses so that you pay the right people. Let me unpack that a bit. When we incepted the company several years ago, we started with one business. It was not Monash Health, albeit they're a customer of ours that we're very proud to call a customer. It might have been Nick Scully, customer number one, and we went about verifying Nick Scully or our first customer's supplier base. And we did that using two methods. The one is manual, where we did the callback controls that a customer might have done, but we have an expert team of fraud analysts doing them, and we went about rigorously and effectively verifying all their suppliers. The next thing we did is we have some proprietary software called BankLink that extracts, it just requires a supplier to log in to a system and we can extract their details directly from the bank. And that was software created by our founders. So we went and verified a company, one of our first customers, vendor set. And then we went sector by sector, industry by industry, business by business, doing the same thing. Health, construction, retail, finance, insurance, and we're operating in every category and vertical of the economy today. But what happens over time, as happens in the case of Google Maps, which started off as Waze before they bought the Waze technology, they did it manually at first, but what happens over time is you can start cross-matching data. So some of the suppliers to, let's say, Laing O'Rourke are also supplying Meriton and also supplying Steadfast. It's first within an industry and then it'll start crossing industries. So that brings a form of verification into play, which is your most scalable and perhaps your most powerful, which is cross-matching. You can start cross-matching data, which is if one customer is paying supply at a given set of BSB account number, trading name, and ABN details, and so is a second and so is a third, well, then you're getting a scale of verification and increasing the power of each individual verification. So we take all those verified businesses, we knit them together. We now have three forms of verification operating: manual, BankLink, which is software, and a cross-matching form of verification. And you knit it together in a database. And I'm going to just dive into this database and get a bit more granular for a moment. So let's say Meriton and Laing O'Rourke are both paying Coates hire in the yellow circle at a given set of details. We then have two factors of verification to say that those are the correct details. And we can signal that to Meriton and Laing O'Rourke. So just to be clear, Laing O'Rourke and Meriton are FCHO customers and members of the FCHO database. All the smaller dots are suppliers of our customer organizations. So if we've got two customers, and I'm just speaking in two dimensions, but we might have hundreds of customers paying Coates hire at those details, we can give a green thumb and say this is verified as correct. Two things happen as the database grows. Let's say BuildCorp, also a customer of ours, joins our community or our customer set. Two things happen. The first is we've already verified 70 or 80% of their suppliers and perhaps 90 to 95% of their payments, because there's a concentration of payments. You don't pay all the suppliers in your VMF or your master data equally. It's probably concentrated. But the second thing that happens is now we've got a stronger factor of verification, because BuildCorp are also paying Laing O'Rourke, Coates hire at those same details. So our green thumb gets stronger. It goes from 2 to 3, but just remember I'm speaking in two dimensions, but in fact it could go from 50 to 100. Now let's take it all the way back to those business email compromise scams I mentioned earlier. Let's say Coates hire's email gets compromised and the fraudster manipulates an invoice or gets into the email and tells Meriton that they've changed bank account details. The reason why we and we alone stop those type of scams is because we have a mismatch to who Lang O'Rourke and Build Corp are paying. It's at different details, so we can red thumb it. Where do we provide these green and red thumbs? Well, where it matters, which is before you pay in your online banking. And whether you're paying 5 people, and I've just used Westpac as an example on your screen, or you're paying 5,000 or 10,000 suppliers in a pay run, we can issue those symbols in real time instantly. You literally just log into your online banking. We can also use that same collaborative communal database approach to not just verify bank details. We have other data in there. We can tell you when one of your vendors' tax status has lapsed, or their business registration status has lapsed. In fact, if you've got vendors who need HACCP certification because they're running food kitchens, let's say, we will tell you in real time if those certifications have lapsed. We can also tell you if you're breaching a previously determined payment threshold or making a duplicate payment to those vendors. Now, you might think that's great. You tell me in my online banking, but I need to know before then because my payments go directly from my ERP to the bank. Well, you log into our portal like any other web app, you log in, and we can give you the exact same symbols across any payments file, again, in real time before you pay. So that's this database operating. The other power of a communal approach is, let's say we did red thumb a set of vendor details to Meriton. We will inform every member of the database that those details are fraudulent. So it's a form of a community operating together. At the same time, because you might think, oh, well, how's privacy managed, data managed? We strictly adhere to both public, private, and commercial privacy law and constraints in Australia. The data is unique to you and anonymized. It is shared only insofar as it is verified or not verified, but no one knows your relationships or payments to your suppliers. So that's this powerful database in operation. And in there is customer data, verified supplier data we've extracted from the banks, plus layers of data being drawn down on a daily basis from ASIC, ABR, and a series of credit bureaus. There's also an algorithmic layer in operation, so people can't game this database. They can't set up a company for the purposes of fraud, as in the case of Levitas Capital, because we check recency, we check the number of payments going to any one person. You might be thinking, well, this database has to be big to be effective, and it is big. We have 1.82 million businesses verified in that database. And just bear in mind, there are only about 2.4 million active trading ABNs in Australia. So we verified a huge volume of businesses, but if you allow for concentration of payments, it's probably closer to 90% of payments. We're doing $3.6 million of payments a month. This year it should trend towards $50 billion. So that's a bit about what we do. There are other interesting things we do to keep your payments safe. So one thing you might do is you could take your vendor master file or your vendor master data set and upload it against that database, and we can wash it and check it. Why do you want to do that? Well, across hundreds of VMFs we've ingested, plus this is verified by KPMG as a business, most of your vendor master files will be dirty-ish. I use that word deliberately because it's not all highly risky, but you'll have a distribution of anomalies from 1 to about 25% where your data is just a bit off. It's not all incorrect bank account numbers, so it's not all critically risky to fraud, but often these things create vulnerabilities that fraudsters can exploit. So you could upload your vendor master file and we can instantly wash it and give you a read on how clean it is, how verified it is, where the green part of the donut would be at verified, the red part would be there's a mismatch between BSB account number and ABN, which is really risky in terms of fraud or error. So that's our solution in operation. I'm not here to speak that. I really wanted to talk conceptually about the approach, which is a collaborative approach. We've never seen this done anywhere else, and it's why we've really been fortunate to pick up a huge swath of really leading businesses that we're proud to call customers in every sector. I'm just going to take the last 5 minutes to go through a case study, and then we've got 10 minutes for question and answer. So we issue on average per customer about between 3 and 6 red thumbs a month. Not all of those are frauds. Some of those could be input errors. Some of those could be mismatched names, not numbers. But we see it as it's still an alert to tell people, watch out, be cautious, don't make this payment until you've checked. But in amidst all that, we do stop fraud. And we're often not at liberty to discuss those preventions and saves, but I'm going to step through a case study. It's anonymized, but our customer gave permission to share it in this way. And at some point last year, we saved an over $1 million fraud, and I'm going to step you through it. So it was for a leading construction and engineering firm. Their turnover is over 450 million. They had 19 entities and about just over 11,000 vendors. They became a customer in June 2019. And the part of our solution that saved the fraud is actually the vendor management component. I haven't gone into that today, but to protect your payments on the way out, we use our system to verify vendors as they're added, changed, onboarded, or to clean your existing vendor set. So let me step through this. So there was an attempt at fraud, exactly as I explained earlier on. A cable supplier was compromised, meaning a fraudster would have researched our construction engineering firm customers' relationship to their suppliers. They found this cable supplier, they targeted them, they would have sent them a phishing email, someone would have clicked on the wrong thing, and the cable installation supplier's email system was compromised, and a bank account change email was sent from the cable installation supplier to our customer. In fact, here is the email. It's been redacted, but you can see it follows the previous email trail. It comes from the real email account, and it's sent to the AP team at our customer, and it says, "Hi, Gina, we changed banking details. Do you know when other invoices will be paid?" They sent it at a very perfect time, knowing a payment run was happening. Now, our customer, if they weren't a customer, might have been duped. They might have emailed back, and this fraud could have continued. But because they were using our solution, our customer emailed the supplier, but in fact emailed the fraudster back and said, "I need to send you an FCHA online verification for the change of bank details," right? So then our customer logs into our system. They use the supplier management solution. They execute a change request form, which they've customized to their specifications in our system, and the supplier receives this change request. Bearing in mind, as I said earlier on, the fraudster was in the supplier's email system, had those filters in operation, and so the fraudster responded, okay? The fraudster responded. Now, at this point, we start noticing stuff that, let's say, your APT might not be able to. We notice the IP address where the click and the completion of the form is coming from. We also noted that the fraudster did not want to use our bank link verification method. They wanted to complete the form manually. Because of those things, the form actually goes back to our team before we will pass it back onto our customer's team. So at that point, we use our team to execute a manual callback control using all the expert sort of awareness, alertness, and methodology. And in doing the callback control, we independently source the details, phone the real supplier. At that point, it's clear that the fraudster had completed the change request form, and we inform our customer, we've picked up the fraud, we alert the rest of the network, we blacklist the account, okay? Now, apropos what I said early on, had our customer not put this supplier and hence the fraudster through the change request and just passed it through their online banking, we would have still red thumbed it at the point of payment, not just at the supplier onboarding point. So that's an example of our system in operation. That payment that was red flagged and prevented was $250,000, but there were 2 subsequent payments happening within 3 days, totaling $1 million. And the benefits are multiple, not just to our customer, where we prevented the scheduled payments and the current payment, but also to the supplier, because the supplier could tell all their customers that their account had been compromised, please stop, and saved other frauds from happening. And as I mentioned, we blacklist the account. So that's a collaborative approach to cybersecurity in practice. I really want to thank so many of you, almost everyone stayed till the end. Hopefully you are getting some value from it. And with that, I'm going to conclude the presentation, turn my camera back on, and ask Nick to shepherd any questions to me. So thank you very much for your time and your attention today. I am going to pause the share, so you should have me in your screen. Nick, can you let me know if there are any questions that I can get answered? And if Mark's on, my colleague Mark Chazen and co-founder, I'm not sure if Mark's joined, but if not, I will answer those questions.
Yes, I've joined. Thanks to everyone for joining the webinar.
Thanks, Mark.
Happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. So if you do have any questions at this point, there is a tab in your control panel called questions, and you can type in your questions there, and I'll ask them to Gavin and Mark. So yeah, if you put in your questions now, then we'll answer them. So the first question, I'll start with Chris Pandey's question. So we have process of calling back to suppliers to confirm when the change of detail email is received. Isn't this a foolproof system of avoiding potential fraud?
I'll hand that one to Mark. I did mention some of the flaws in most people's callback controls, but I'll let Mark articulate it and add to it.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not. Nothing really is foolproof. Some of the things that we've seen in the past, for example, are you make a callback, and especially with COVID, a lot of people aren't working in the office, and so you leave a voicemail. What typically happens in a lot of companies is that automatically gets forwarded as an email to the person to call back. And what we've seen is that email chain has been compromised, and the person calling back has been a fraudster. And in fact, what they do is they download an app off the App Store where you can actually put in whatever phone number you want the caller ID to show, and they fake the caller ID of the actual call. Of what the legitimate call would be, and they called back and confirmed that the details were correct. So, unless the team is really trained to understand that you cannot actually accept a callback. In our case, for example, our team would receive the callback, and we would then say, "Thank you for calling us back. Can we call you right back right now on the number that we know for you, because we can't accept incoming calls." So we've seen that in the past. We've also seen cases where the phone number that's being used by the customer to call back was sourced either off an old invoice or current invoice that had been doctored, or the ERP system had been compromised, and so they're calling the wrong number. We've seen that in the past. Other things that have happened is because it's not the primary responsibility and the primary training that the accounts payable people have received, they actually don't always ask the right questions. So in a case of a business that actually joined us after that have over $1 million fraud, what had happened was there was also a compromise in the email system. They did independently call the correct supplier, and the supplier had indeed actually changed their bank details legitimately. But what they hadn't changed them to was obviously the fraudster's account. And when the person made the callback, they asked, we received this change of details from you. Can you confirm that you've recently changed your details? And the company said they had. But in fact, the follow-up question should have been, but did you change it to these particular details? And they didn't ask that question and ultimately got defrauded. And that's, it might sound with hindsight that, well, that's an obvious question. But when AP teams are really under pressure and they're just trying to get their work done, and they haven't been trained on all these kind of things, it's quite often that they make a mistake and a fraud happens. It's much better to have the power of the network or independent controls in addition to those callback controls to basically give you that level of comfort.
Absolutely. If I can just underline what Mark said in one area, which is your team might be foolproof 20 times in a row, 40 times in a row. Can you maintain that? And fraudsters just need the gap, because they don't just need you to click, they need you to click once. That's all. So yes, back to you, Nick.
Yeah, so we have quite a few questions. I see we're getting close to the end of the time. We'll answer all of them. And yeah, so sorry that we go a bit over time, but
we'll just go over.
Yeah. So a question from Peter Franklin: is this service available in New Zealand?
Cameron, you take that, or do you want me?
You can take it. Just they've heard my voice for a long time, I think. Yes.
Okay. So yes. So we are actually rolling it out to New Zealand right now. We have a number of Australian customers that have New Zealand suppliers, and that we basically rolling it out to their suppliers in New Zealand. We do have some new New Zealand customers that will be going live very shortly. So it is currently being rolled out to New Zealand as we speak. So yeah, in the next sort of month or so, it'll be fully live.
Yeah, and then I think a follow-up question from Claire is, what are your plans with international payment protection? So paying international suppliers?
Yeah, so
yeah, Mark,
we currently do support verifying of international suppliers to a certain limited number of countries. Currently, they're the English-speaking countries predominantly, such as US, UK, Canada, South Africa, Singapore, and one or two other European countries. We will roll it out to other regions as well as we go. We're doing it based on the need of our customers, basically the driving force, how many customers want particular countries, and we're slowly rolling that out. But currently it is live to those above countries that I mentioned.
And then another follow-up question. Do we have checks in place to verify IBAN payments?
So again, it's similar to that. We check for certain selected countries, we check IBAN payments, and basically have some software that validates the certain numbers within the system. But yeah, so it is to a limited number of countries at the moment.
All right. And then a question from Ali. What is the procedure to verify bank details of a supplier that is new to us and also is not in the EFT short database?
So what happens in that case is the supplier, the customer would get from the new supplier information that they're taking them on board. They would then go into our system and send out an onboarding form to this new supplier. As Gavin mentioned in his presentation, there's a one-time setup when you implement our system to actually just set up the form with all the fields that you would normally require. So it can have all sorts of questions, obviously all the standard ones, name, address, ABN, etc. But it can also include things like certificates of currency if you need them, or working with children if you're a school, for example. And then basically once that form is set up, you come in, you send out the invite to the supplier receives it, they fill out all the details. We also have a two-factor authentication, so they can actually get a text as well, so we know that the right person is filling out the form with a one-time password. They fill it all out. We then verify those details independently. Because it's not in our database already, it can't be cross-matched, but then the supplier can either go through the bank link technology, in which case they basically log into their bank through the system, and our system automatically determines what those details are directly from the bank and cross-matches it to the ABN and the ABR, the trading names. Alternatively, if they don't do that, we then do the independent call, verify the details, and then it becomes available to the customer for download either as a PDF or as an extract as a CSV, or in more sophisticated implementations, they can be pulled straight into the ERP through an API.
All right. And then the next question is, what if FSHO's processes are breached? Who's liable if a fraud is committed? Question by Darren Shearer.
Sorry, Mark, I'm gonna keep handing the ball to you. You keep going, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So the way we position ourselves is that we look at controls that businesses would have, and they might have 80% controls. Their goal is always to get to 100% perfection. We know no one is ever going to be 100%. We believe we take them to sort of 95% or above. And in a similar way to the way you would have antivirus on your machine, you wouldn't run a business without antivirus, yet viruses still might get through, and if they do get through, the antivirus company is not going to cover those losses. In the same way, we don't take liability for a fraudulent payment. Having said that, it's important to realize that for a fraudulent payment to go through, they have to both compromise our system and your system, because they have to match. Otherwise, if they have only compromised our system or your system, it would be a mismatch, and you get a red thumb, which would lead to further investigation before payment is made. So in short, we don't cover the actual liability directly unless we've been negligent or fraudulent, in which case we do have insurance to cover that. But in terms of just a standard kind of mistake, or not mistake, but very sophisticated attempt that might have got through that we hadn't anticipated, we don't currently cover that. But having said that, we have never had an incidence where we've actually misreported something being correct in the sort of 6 years that we've been operating.
And then I found another question from Darren Shearer. Like, why not verify bank deposit slips?
Sorry, what was the question?
So why wouldn't you verify bank deposit slips?
That's not after the fact. I could be misunderstanding the question.
I'm not really sure I understand.
Yeah.
What context.
If Darren is still on the call, then maybe if you could clarify your question.
Yeah.
In the meantime, a question from David Feinberg. Our organization would love to speak to F-Shore. How do I get in touch to set up a meeting with your sales team?
The quickest way would be to go to our website. There are many buttons to press. You could request a demo. You could get in touch. You could certainly mail info or sales at F-Shore. There are multiple ways, but the shorthand for that is please go to our website, which is, sorry, ftshore.com.au, EFTshore.com.au.
Okay, I think that is all the questions for today. Oh, wait, Darren just got back to me. From an AP department point of view, verifying bank deposit slips of suppliers would be a simple method to confirm bank details, ?
So I'm assuming that maybe he means by that you're asking the supplier to give you a copy of a bank deposit slip. If that is the case, yes, certainly a number of businesses do ask suppliers to provide either a copy of their bank statement at the top level of the bank statement with their account details, or a bank deposit slip. The problem with it is it's usually sent over email, and these can be forged. We've seen a number of cases where these have been photoshopped and doctored. So I'm not sure if I'm answering the exact question, but if that's sort of where it's coming from, then yeah, we can't really rely on anything coming via email or even being uploaded to the system as without an independent check of it, because those documents we've seen many times been forged.
Yeah, I think that's what Darren meant. He confirmed it in the question tab. And then one more question that just came in from Chris. Is F-Shore a type of blockchain? It's an interesting one.
Yeah, so conceptually, it's a kind of a blockchain. It's not formally implemented as a blockchain, but a lot of the same elements basically apply to it. So yes, it's often sort of compared to that. But on a technical level, it's not exactly a blockchain, but it's very, very similar to the way, because we've got these multiple data points that are all basically validating each other. It is a similar concept, and we are looking at expanding into technically also utilizing blockchain for that purpose.
Yeah, Ross Thorpe, who opened this webinar, uses the phrase blockchain-esque. So maybe that's another way of just labeling what Mark said.
All right, I think that was the last question. People have had the time to do this.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. This session has been recorded. We'll make a few edits, and hopefully tomorrow morning, tomorrow early afternoon, we'll be emailing you for the recordings, with the recordings. If there's any questions in the meantime, please feel free to reach out or visit our website.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And have a good afternoon.
You too.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you. Thanks.